In this video, I'm going to talk you through my approach to shooting the Northern Lights, or the Aurora Borealis, and everything I've learned in how to capture effective images of this elusive natural spectacle in the UK or similar latitudes. My history with shooting the Aurora goes all the way back to 2013, where I was fortunate enough to shoot it out my very front door here on the Isle of Man. Looking back at that first image, I think it's fair to say it was a pretty shoddy attempt though. However, by sheer coincidence, a mere 2 weeks later, I travelled up to Tromsø in northern Norway to see the Northern Lights, and of the 4 nights I stayed there, I actually saw the Northern Lights on 3 of those nights, and it was without doubt one of the greatest natural spectacles I've ever seen. But that was my first and last trip in pursuit of seeing the Aurora. However, I have been fortunate enough to see the actual Northern Lights maybe about a dozen times since here on the Isle of Man. Unfortunately, most of the images I've captured of the Aurora in years gone by have been pretty ham-fisted attempts, to be fair, but I've learned the hard way how to perfect these images over time, and I'm here to help you shortcut that failure part entirely. It's become clear to me that the experience of shooting the Aurora up in places like Tromsø in the Arctic Circle is wildly different to the experience of shooting the Aurora in the UK. So the tips in this video are geared to shooting the Northern Lights in locations where the spectacle is more elusive, rare, challenging, and dare I say, more photographically satisfying. I actually saw the Northern Lights here in the Isle of Man most recently about a month ago, and I think it's fair to say I absolutely nailed it. I'll show you the images a little later in this video. Right place, right time. This is the most challenging aspect to get correct. It's not actually all that difficult to see the lights, but it does require a lot of variables aligning together to provide you with those shooting opportunities. Geography. The Aurora Borealis forms in a giant oval-shaped belt that sweeps across places like northern Russia, Scandinavia, and Canada. Note in the southern hemisphere it's called the Aurora Australis, and the same principles broadly apply. In simple terms, the further north you go, closer to this belt, the greater your chances of seeing the Aurora. Stronger solar activity pushes this belt further south. Here in the Isle of Man, where I live, it's 54 degrees north, and I'll maybe get one strong showing a year if I'm lucky. However, if you lived up in the far north of Scotland, for example, at say 60 degrees north, your odds of getting those displays is going to be far, far greater. However, if you lived in the south of England at say 51 degrees north, you'll rarely get any displays at all. So really, if you want to increase your odds for success, travel north. Time of year. This sounds really obvious, but it needs to be dark to see the Northern Lights. Here where I live, between May and July, it's a waste of time even trying to see them because the nights don't get sufficiently dark. Northern Light activity happens year round, but it does actually peak around the equinoxes in March and September, so that's something worth keeping in mind. Light pollution. To give yourself the best chance of seeing the lights, you need to get as far away from man-made light pollution as you possibly can, particularly in the northern-facing skies. Light pollution will wash away all the contrast in your images and render them pretty underwhelming. Natural light from the moon can also pose the same problem, so try your best to avoid shooting around the full moon. Clear skies. Pay close attention to the weather forecasts and use a variety of weather apps to try and predict the likelihood for clear skies. Specifically focus on skies north from your location. All you need is a small window of clear sky down low on the northern horizon. Cloud cover directly above you doesn't necessarily matter at all. Location. Travel to somewhere that gives you good, clear, unobscured views of the northern horizon, and also somewhere that gives you some good foreground and mid-ground subjects to work with. Silhouettes can work particularly well, but make sure that the object is recognizable and has good prominence above the horizon line. Close foreground subjects are difficult to shoot due to the shallow depth of field that you'll encounter when shooting at wider apertures. Water can work very well for foregrounds as it tends to lift the entire exposure and it will reflect those beautiful colours in the sky. Aurora activity. In my experience, the moment you think it's definitely going to happen is when it doesn't. It's elusive. That's what makes it challenging. It's very easy when explaining this to get bogged down in overly technical science jargon. So I'm going to keep things very, very simple because my understanding of it is very, very simple. Basically, think of Aurora a bit like space weather. On average, activity from the sun takes about 1 to 3 days to reach us here on planet Earth, which means we always get a degree of forward notice of those spikes in activity. Keep your eyes peeled for news of coronal mass ejections from the sun's surface, particularly those directed straight at Earth. The KP index is used to rate the strength of activity. Here where I live, I'll generally need at least a KP rating of 5 to 6 to stand any chance of getting any significant showing of the aurora. If you do happen to see geomagnetic storm warnings, particularly those rated above 1, that's a good sign for some intense periods of activity coming your way. There's absolutely loads of sites, apps and online groups that can provide you with this type of information. Just search them. I'll put a few standout ones on screen for you now. Mobile apps work particularly well to give you those push notifications straight to your mobile, warning you about those spikes in activity. You can, in theory, rely solely on these apps, but you have to be able to react quickly. The peaks in activity that push aurora activity this far south tend to be very short-lived, and the apps are effectively warning you in real time. I tend to find a much better approach is to arm yourself with knowledge of what to potentially expect, and the only way to do that is to be a nerd and to religiously look at these online resources. The right gear. A camera with good high ISO performance. You don't necessarily need a great camera to capture images of the aurora, but it's certainly an advantage if your camera is capable of performing better at those higher ISO levels, as it will give you cleaner final images. Generally speaking, the bigger your sensor, the better the quality of those images that you'll be able to capture. Sturdy tripod. Arm yourself with a solid tripod that will keep your camera locked still for the long exposures that you're going to need to capture. Don't extend the center column up, and try to use cable releases or timing delays to minimize the vibrations that you put in to your camera when capturing your shots. Fast lenses. Aim to utilize a maximum aperture of at least f2.8, as this will maximize your light gathering capabilities and thereby boost your image quality. It's my personal recommendation that fast prime lenses like 1.4s, 1.8s tend to excel for aurora shooting. Focal length choice tends to actually depend on where you live to some extent, because when I was up in Tromsø, the northern lights were actually happening directly above me, which meant that super wide focal lengths of say 14 millimeters truly came into their own. However, the experience at lower latitudes is completely different because the aurora will tend to occur at much lower angles in the night sky. Where I live, I find the magic range is about 24mm through to 50mm. Don't ignore the longer focal lengths either. 85mm prime lenses are absolutely superb for capturing great images of displays that really hug that northern horizon. The right settings. Keep your aperture wide. Generally, I'd advise shooting your lens wide open to maximize the light gathering capabilities of your equipment. This will enable you to get cleaner images and to shoot at optimal shutter speeds. If you're using super fast primes like 1.2s or 1.4s, you can potentially stop down the lens a little to give you better corner performance, but generally speaking, the wider you shoot, the better. Avoid overly long shutter speeds. Exposures of over 20 seconds won't work because it will erase all the fine detail from the aurora structure and it will render the northern lights a giant green blob within your image and it doesn't look particularly great. I tend to find that exposures between 5 and 10 seconds work really well to give you a decent exposure, but also allowing you to capture lots of nice fine detail in the pillars and ribbons of light. If you're shooting with a 50mm lens or longer, you'll need to shoot towards the bottom of that range to make sure that you're not capturing star trailing within your images. Don't push your ISO too high. An ISO between 1600 and 2500 should be perfectly sufficient to get a decent enough exposure while minimizing noise in your image, particularly if you're using faster primes. If you're using slower lenses, then you'll probably have to change that range to something more like 3200 to 5000. Set focus at infinity. Shooting at wider apertures creates very shallow depth of field, so focus accuracy becomes increasingly important. Use bright stars or distant points of light to manually adjust focus to render those points of light as small as possible. Everything else I have described is null and void if you mess this up. No pressure. Weaker displays of the aurora can be very underwhelming to the actual eye, but it's always worth shooting it with your camera when you get given the opportunity because the camera will amplify the spectacle. It's important to be 100% clear what your eyes see and what the camera sees are completely different. The camera will always draw out more saturation and more contrast in the aurora borealis. When things really kick off, you'll know about it because that gap between what your camera sees and what your eyes see will narrow and the spectacle will become very visually impressive. You'll get the emergence of moving pillars and columns of light that sort of move side to side across the horizon line. You'll get the emergence of extra colours over and above the default green as well. You'll get yellows, reds, even purples emerging in the night sky. And if you're very lucky with very strong activity, you can get distinct horizontal banding of activity where you start to see the emergence of those telltale ripples and ribbons that extend vertically across the night sky. If you see it, it is incredible. And in all my years of shooting it here on the island, I've only seen 3 occasions where it's hit this mark. Which brings me neatly to the part of the video where I show you my latest images. If you've been following my photography for any length of time, you'll know that I like to shoot my local little lighthouse that's called Winky. I've taken shots of Winky with the Milky Way above, star trails with noctilucent clouds full moons, constellations of stars, and even a comet. But there's always been one glaring omission from my Winky portfolio. I definitely feel these are technically the best Aurora shots I've taken to date. To capture the images, I used my 50mm 1.8s, which is actually filming me right now. I also used my 35 1.8s, which is just there, and I also used my old 85 1.8G with the FTZ adapter as well. I'm not too sure which of the images I actually prefer, because I think they've all got sort of distinct merits of their own. So I'm going to need your help at this point. Down below in the comments, let me know which of the images you think is the standout. So that brings me to a close on this week's video. I hope the information I provided arms you with the information you need to make sure that you can pounce when those all-important and elusive Aurora shooting opportunities present themselves to you. Good luck.